Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on whatever time zone you might be in. Welcome to another speaker forum for the Burma Spring Benefit Film Festival. My name is Kenneth Wong. I'm a Burmese American writer, blogger, language instructor. I will also be the moderator for this live discussion. Today's talk is titled Decades of Defiance from 88 Generation to Spring Revolution. So first, let's go ahead and meet the panelists that we've got here to talk about this. I'd like to call on Brad Adams from Human Rights Watch first. Brad, welcome. Would you mind saying a few words about who you are and do your self-introduction? 2 minutes, please.
Sure, thank you. I'll be much briefer. I'm the Asia Director at Human Rights Watch, have been since 2002. Before that, I worked in Cambodia for a number of years for the United Nations. I'm responsible for our work across Asia from Afghanistan to North Korea. The first time I was in Burma was in 1993. I've followed the country very closely now for almost 3 decades. And I've been in charge of all of our work on Burma, since before the Saffron Revolution, and seen every iteration of military government, military dictatorship, repression that they've been able to offer. I guess I specialize in freedom of expression issues. I've done a lot of work on international justice in Cambodia and elsewhere, and spent a lot of time working on the Rohingya issue. I shouldn't say Rohingya issue, that trivializes it. The Rohingya atrocities, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, however you want to call it, in recent years. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So glad that you are able to join us. The next speaker I'd like to call upon is Ben Fleming. Ben Fleming is from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Ben, welcome. Self-introduction, please.
Hello, everybody. Mingalaba. My name is Ben. I'm an adjunct professor at SIPA at Columbia and also at South Texas College of Law in Houston. Relevant to this panel, I began my first trip to Burma was in 2007, about a week before the Saffron Revolution took place. I started working there professionally in 2014. I taught a short course in public international law and international human rights law at Mandalay University. I also, in the same year, founded and have subsequently co-run for 7 years now a program training junior law faculty in pedagogy and human rights and public international law. I've also run 2 projects for Equality Myanmar with help from students from SIPA, which is the civil society organization founded by and formerly run by NUG Minister of Human Rights, U Aung Myo Min.
Glad you bring up his name because tomorrow I'll be speaking to U Aung Myo Min, the Minister of NUG for Human Rights, in the next panel. So we'll say more about that before the end of this panel. I'd also like to invite the next speaker, Christina Fink from George Washington University Elliott School. Christina, self-introduction, please.
Thank you so much, Kenneth, and it's an honor to be on this panel today. And I'm a professor at George Washington University. I've been there for the last 10 years, but I've been working on Myanmar issues since the 1990s, and particularly with civil society organizations. I've also been writing about Myanmar since that time. I wrote a book on life under military rule called Living Silence in Burma. And I'm currently completing a book on the 10 years of semi-democracy from 2011 to 2021. Thank you.
We'll have a lot more questions to you about the last 10 years and how maybe in the next couple of years, we may look upon these 10 years as the golden ages. Let's hope that's not the case, but that seems to be the way it is right now. So the final panelist that we've got here is Sia Utonia. Sia Utonia is Associate Professor of Political Science at Carleton College, Northfield. Sia, welcome. Would you mind doing your self-introduction, please?
Yeah, thank you. Mingalaba, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this panel, and also those organizers who have been organizing the film festival. Thank you so much. I was a student activist in 1988 as a high school student. And then after the coup on September 18, I went to Thai-Burmese border, and then on the border for 2 years, organizing student army, if you will, or a type of PDF right now with Gen Z being trained. So after 2 years, I became a refugee under the UNHCR in Bangkok. And after that, I got a scholarship from the United States State Department to study in the US. So I did all my degrees, BA, MA, PhD at Indiana University, Bloomington. My degree is in law and social sciences, but it's sort of public politics as a public law sense. And my focus is on the environmental politics and political economy. That's what I teach, and I do research. I was able to go back to Myanmar in 2013. Since then, every year I have been going back until now, and I won't be able to go back again. And I've been writing on Burma as well. And my current one is working on Burma, a book on Burma about the challenges of state building since the kingdoms ended. So what is going on with that? And then recently with the coup, I also co-founded Mutual Aid Myanmar, which is basically fundraising. We have now nearly to 500,000 already, and over 6,000 CDM participants are being funded by a lot of donors who contribute to the Mutual Aid Myanmar. So that would be it, and I'm looking forward to a conversation with everyone here on the panel. Thank you.
It's extremely important for us to be able to continue to support these participants of the civil disobedience movement, because many of them has lost their job and they are in hiding, so in great hardship. Thank you for doing the work that you're doing. I'm going to start with you, Sia Utonia. You look as young as I am, so I'm thinking that you have. So I'm thinking that you have personally witnessed probably the '88 student uprising, and then after that, somehow you have also seen 2007 Saffron Revolution, and then now, of course, we're watching the Nue Utonia, the Burma Spring happening. Are these three different types of uprising? Do they have similarities? How would you categorize them?
Yeah, there are similarity and there are also differences, significant differences. So I'll start with the three conditions that are significantly different from between 1988 and 2021. One is the obvious one, which is a smartphones and internet is a huge difference. In 1988, when I was organizing street protests, in the evening, after we finished all the strike around the city, we would listen to BBC Christopher Gunness, where we're reporting on what is happening, what had happened today, and then we would strategize for what we would do tomorrow based on the shortwave radio report from BBC Burmese program, basically. And that was our only source of outlet, window to the world, basically. And so now you can imagine the difference, huge difference. Right now, the Gen Z and all that are organizing a digital democracy, live feeding on Facebooks and Twitters and TikToks and you name it, right? And so that's number one. Number two is the young generation that is leading this movement. They have lived under the military dictatorship half of their life, and they lived under the imperfect democratic system for 10 years. So they know at least what it's like, life is like to live under the military dictatorship and what is life to live under the democracy. And this generation is very determined. We did not in '88 have a comparison of sort. We knew the socialist system was unjust and we needed to overthrow that one-party democratic system. And so that is what '88 movement was, we did. So that leads to the third condition, which is probably the most significant condition in terms of international communities, their thinking and their observation of Myanmar, because especially like country like China or ASEAN country, which are looking at Myanmar, which is the instability that we are seeing in Burma and violence that we are seeing in Burma was created by military coup leaders. It is not the instability that was created by the public and the military kind of have to march on the street and stage a coup. So that condition is a very, very significant for international community as they are thinking, formulating how to engage with the Myanmar democracy movement and how to engage, or should they engage with current coup council leaders, because the public has zero trust to the current military leader. So they are the one who created all kinds of violence that we are seeing. They are the one who created the instability. Before February 1st, Myanmar was democratic, even though it was imperfect. And all of that was basically swept away by this violent mechanism of raw brute force that we are seeing in the world. And so the military has made itself to be the largest terrorist organization in the world, as we are seeing daily. So that is a very significant condition. And I would like the international community, especially policymakers or observers who are making important decisions, to think in that context. So I would say those three, I will leave with that, and then we can continue our conversation on.
That's a very good way to sort of like set up the three fundamental differences in these. By the way, I did some rough maths about the number of questions we want to tackle and the number of panelists we have here. So if we spend about 2 to 3 minutes on each responses, I think we'll be right on time. So with that, I'm going to call on Brett. Brett, you have been watching Burma throughout these 3 different revolutions, and you witness all different sorts of human rights violations. What you were seeing then and what you're seeing now significantly different? Can you point to any kind of differences?
Well, I think the military has, as horrible as they've been, and I don't want to understate it, they've probably been more restrained, partly because of the reasons that were just suggested. There is much more ability to get information out about what they are doing and to record it. And so there's been some care taken. We saw this also with the 2017 attacks on the Rohingya. The Burmese military, the Tatmadaw, had learned from the Sri Lankan army not to repeat their mistakes, because when the Sri Lankan army engaged in more or less their final solution against the Tamil Tigers, a lot of it was videoed by soldiers and uploaded as trophy videos. They saw the risk of having this kind of material disseminated. So I think they've been more restrained. I think they probably received more coaching from outside. I mean, I don't know. It's impossible to know what the Chinese or others, the Russians, are suggesting to them, but I think they've probably been talking to them about being careful, about being restrained. So I think that's one difference. I think another difference, which cuts in both directions, is China has a much more muscular foreign policy now. And China is engaged in a duel with the United States and the West that didn't really exist in 1988 or even in 2007. And so the West, the United States and others have been very cautious in their response to this. I mean, they've said all the right things, but they haven't taken very strong action. And there's a number of reasons, but it's part of the great power competition in Southeast Asia, which can be good if the United States and others decide that supporting democracy and supporting people on the ground is a good strategy. And it can be problematic if they want to make friends with the Chinese or make allies with the Chinese and things like climate change or other things. So it's a much more complicated international situation in which this is all taking place. And I think we've seen various countries, the Australians are a good example, a country that's pulling its punches. Japan is pulling its punches much more than it might have in the past. And then the last thing is, I think that the view of the protesters is not quite the same as it was in the past. I think there's nothing but sympathy for people on the streets. The CDM has everybody's sympathy, but they don't have that leader. Aung San Suu Kyi, you'll notice there's very few people campaigning on her behalf because her star fell so strongly internationally because of the way she dealt with the Rohingya, but not just the Rohingya, the way she dealt with dissent, the fact that there were more political prisoners during her period than when she came to office. The fact that she seemed indifferent to reform and democratization, except for the fact that she wanted to amend the Constitution, which seemed to some people to be more self-centered than for the good of the country. So it helps to have a galvanizing person to rally around, and that's one thing I hope that will emerge. That doesn't have to be a single person, but I think we need some strong international leadership, and I think that the leadership of the NUG is doing a good job so far. Maybe they'll emerge and help, because the rest of the world probably wants to be able to identify more closely with the opposition and the resistance than they can right now. And I don't discount that possibility, but let's not forget that Aung San Suu Kyi was a major rallying cry for all those previous periods.
On the other hand, student leaders like Minko and Nine have actually pointed out that precisely because this movement does not have leader, it makes it much harder to suppress it, because if you catch the leader and you throw it in prison, the movement is crippled. By the way, Brett, I wonder if you could move to the front a little bit so that we can hear better audio from you, if it is possible at all.
Sure.
For now, I'm going to have this. I have this question. I think I'm going to go around all of you and call on you to talk about this, respond to this question. I'm going to start with you, Christina. Did you see the coup coming? Should we have seen it coming? In retrospect, were there signs that shows that, this thing is looming, it's about to happen?
Well, you know, the commander-in-chief was already talking about possibly staging a coup about 6 months or more before the coup actually happened. And there were some smaller parties who even encouraged him to challenge the election results before the election happened. So I think there was some sense that, you know, he knew that probably the election wasn't going to go the way he wanted it to go. In other words, the military did not want to see the NLD win another landslide victory. Their hope was that they could cobble together a coalition of the army-backed party together with some other smaller parties, probably some of the ethnic parties. And then the military would have its own partner, its own ex-military people in the civilian posts in the government, and they would be sharing power together. And they tolerated one term of the NLD leaving the government, but they didn't want to go for another term. That said, I think, you know, people felt that the military was sitting pretty. They had so much power already. They had autonomy over their own affairs. They also play an enormous role in the economy through their military-owned conglomerates. So it seemed like they were shooting themselves in the foot to stage this coup, which is why, even though there was a lot of noise that this was maybe coming, a lot of people thought it couldn't really happen.
Ben, what about you? What about your thoughts on it? Did you see it coming? Oh, Ben, sorry, you're on mute.
Short answer, sorry. Short answer is no. And
No.
I'm a little bit ashamed, actually, because I feel like I maybe fell victim to this great American navel gazing that we've had through Trump and through COVID. I think all of us knew that it was a possibility. But I do feel like, and I'm not really a macro guy, but I do think there was a special confluence of events that gave the senior general, whose name I don't even like speaking, the impetus to do it, the reason to do it. Whether you want to, it's Trump, it's Modi, it's Xi, it's COVID. I don't think without a very special confluence he would have done it when he did. So yes, it caught me by surprise, even if it should not have.
Brad, what about you? Did you see it coming? Were you taken by surprise?
Oh no, I argued that it wouldn't happen to people because for precisely the reasons that Christina mentioned.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it was against their own interests, but I think what they decided was they didn't win the first election, they got slaughtered in the second election, and they would not win a third or a fourth election. So they saw no path through elections to regaining power fully. I think they wanted to sanitize themselves the way that some regimes have through elections when they've stepped back from autocracy and then held basically pseudo elections. And they didn't see a path for that. That said, it still seems to me to be against their interests. But, you know, when I was in Naypyidaw a few years ago and met with the deputy defense minister, I learned something very compelling, which was he was meeting with me as Human Rights Watch, and we were talking about military justice and impunity and the fact that soldiers could kill and get away with it. And he flat out denied everything. It was as if he was living in some alternative universe. And many officials we met came across the same way. And so I think he's just out of touch with reality, probably is very surprised by the reaction, thought he got away with what he did to the Rohingya, and why couldn't he get away with this?
If outsiders, international observers didn't see it coming, most of them were surprised by it. How about you as a Burmese national coming back from it with background? Were you surprised by it?
Not at all. One 2008 constitution was approved and one 2010 election was started. And there are political leaders within Myanmar and also people within Myanmar who disagree that political leader with engage with military's election, right? NLD itself was quite hesitant to actually enter the election in 2010 as well. So if you look at 2008 constitution, military took three ministries that Christina talked about, autonomous control. Those are defense for sure is easy, that makes sense. The home interior or home ministry, and which is very important because you control police, prison, and budget of the local administration all the way down to the headman level of a ward or a village, right? And the third they control is a border affair, which means proxy for controlling ethnic groups and making sure ethnic groups are being watched carefully by them. Those three conditions are met by the 2008 constitution. They were quite satisfied that they think they could control. And that control mechanism, as long as they begin to see that the movement of democratic democratic government was functioning well in 5 years from 2015 to 2020, they begin to see a threat coming at constitution. Obviously, November of 2019, the opposition National League for Democracy was already suggesting the amendments, which were suggested by Ukoni, who was shot dead in Yangon airport in 2017, I think. That bullet was made to NLD vis-a-vis Daw Aung San Suu Kyi. So that was how serious they are about protecting their constitution, their power. So there's no question in 2020, early on in January, before Chinese President Xi went to Yangon, Naypyidaw, they have put out 114 amendments of the constitution by the NLD, right? So those amendments basically are to get rid of two ministries, home and border affairs, and give it to the civilian. And then eventually, slowly, 25% members of parliament automatically appointed by defense commander-in-chief be by 2025 or 2030, I think, eliminated, right? And those were written on the wall, the military power is going to be eliminated. So I think this is a collective decision, not just the guy in charge right now of the coup that they have made. And military collective means military supporters and so on. So this is really not surprising to me and to my several colleagues in Yangon, including business, small and medium-sized enterprises who lead these industries. So this was coming. That the NLD party leadership should have also prepared that this was coming.
In movies like My Buddha is Punk, we saw a culture clash between the young people in this 10-year of partial opening, where they are starting to adopt things like rap and punk music and started to walk around with spiky hair and Doc Marten boots, and then they are coming in contact with the conservative Buddhist society. Some people say some sort of backlash is inevitable. So is what we are looking at right now merely a backlash because of change coming at breakneck speed, or is it actually the outcome of General Min Aung Hlaine's personal ambition? Ben, would you like to say something about that?
Oh, I mean, I would much prefer, and I defer to what Thu Nhiet just said. But sure, I can take a stab at it. As far as the punk rock scene, it seemed much more. That was up my alley as a young man, but it seemed much more robust in 2007 than it did last I was there in 2019. But Burma resists all essentializing. So does the general have ambitions? Yes, and some of it's tied into that. But I think the question is really what changed at what speed. I think the country, and especially Gen Z, changed really rapidly, and because they caught on to it young, just like learning a foreign language, for example, the earlier you start, the quicker you pick it up. The dynamics that I've seen are, whether it's English or technology or even learning Chinese or a foreign language of any sort, that generation was moving very quickly, and the middle-aged and older generations were moving more slowly. The institutions were moving slowly. So the soldier and the princess, the Tatmadaw and the NLD moved too slowly, whilst business and Gen Z moved quickly. So did the country move too quickly? No. Did those institutions move too slowly to keep up with what the people wanted? Yes, that would be, one 42-year-old white guy's opinion on it.
What do you think? I've heard the conservative factions and the army supporters often say they are the guardian and the protector of the traditional way of life. Are we looking at conservative society saying we want to hold on to the old values, or are we looking at just one man's personal ambitions driving this?
Are you asking me?
I am.
Oh, okay. Thank you. It is a complex question in terms of the people who are seemingly supporting the military, and also people who might be on the fence as well. And Gen Z as well. This is a not easy question to answer. However, I would agree with what Ben said in terms of how slow political processes were in terms of reforming to in line with the democratic principles, right? One of the ministries that would have been swiftly moved to reform should have been education. And it turned out education was the slowest ministry to reform. Even Yangon University was allowed to reform because the military leaders appointed. Some of the deans were former military leaders, you know that, right? In Yangon. So what I mean by that is that was really so. That could have been the one that under the control of the civilian government, 75% elected members of parliament, right? And they should have started that reform aggressively in line with the Gen Z's desire. The other is the 2007 Saffron monks and the current monks and the 88 monks. Sangha has transformed quite a bit in those three episodes of Myanmar history, 2007 to 2021. Here we are seeing clearly a ultra national conservative Buddhists who are basically using religion as a pivot for their own power and position, and other who are now Buddhism as a philosophy of life, and which are more liberal portion of it. And then there are others who share with all religion have their own values in pivoting life, right? Those are Generation Zs and other open-minded people, including ethnic minorities. So in these three segments, I think all of them are struggling to define the identity of Union of Myanmar or Myanmar, right? Which is going to be detrimental because Burma or Myanmar is the most diverse country in Southeast Asia, maybe second to Indonesia in terms of some of the elements. But Myanmar kings have been trying to define that identity. And since independence, each leader has been trying to mobilize that identity. Good luck. That will not happen. That cannot happen because of the beauty of the diversity dynamics and beauty of this diversity of the people in Myanmar. So what they need to think is a new framework, a new society, a new democracy, which is what Gen Z is, I think, thinking. And so none of the, no, I can't say none, but majority of the political leaders, either analogy or in the current movement, they are not thinking along the line with that. They are very slow. These political leaders are very slow, but Gen Z is ahead. The public, people are ahead of the game. You can see this movement, the protests, CDM, all of this creative protests that we are seeing all corners of the country, right? Including remote village area. And people are leading this movement, not the political leader, not NAG, not CRPH leaders. Don't get me wrong. The people are leading this movement and they have to be in sync with that generation of Z and the people. As if they are in sync with them and if they actually follow the lead of the people and make proper functioning as a leader or leading group, that would be a promising revolution to be achieved, the goal to be achieved. So that is how I would say this current situation is.
That's a very good summation of a very complex question. Thank you very much. I'm also thinking about the way the army handled the 88 uprising, and then the way they handled the 2007 protests, and the way they are handling it now. I mean, you know, we hear stories of sniper fires in the middle of urban cities and airstrikes in ethnic regions. Are we looking at an institution that is using its own tried and true methods, or is this institution getting more brutal, more cruel? Christina, do you want to chime in on this? You're on mute, Christina.
Yep. In many ways, they are following their old patterns, which they've used in the ethnic areas against the Rohingya and now against the ethnic Bama population, which is the 4 cuts, which is try to cut, access to information, cut access to recruits, supplies, and, put the people in a state of terror and attack the people rather than your actual enemy, right? So in the ethnic armed areas, instead of attacking the Karen army, they would attack the civilians. And so that kind of campaign of terror is what they have practiced all along, but some of the specific modalities have changed. So as you said, for instance, this time around, we've seen the use of snipers, where in the past, yes, they went after nonviolent demonstrators. This time they've gone after nonviolent demonstrators, but snipers have also just randomly shot into the crowd. They've randomly shot passersby. They've randomly shot into people's houses. They've randomly shot children on the street, in the lane playing. So I think this is a different tactic, but the end is the same. The end is to inspire terror so that people are too afraid to continue their resistance movement and will submit to the regime's power. What we're seeing in the ethnic armed areas is also, a difference in technique, but again, with the same goal. So now the military has helicopter gunships, which is something they did not have in '88. Now they've got drones, so they can actually fly over the areas where ethnic armed groups are located, but those are also places where many young civilians, Gen Z people, have gone to those areas to get military training, to regroup and continue the struggle. And so these drones are flying over these areas to identify where people are, and then they're following up with these helicopter gunships and bombing people, often civilians, not always the armed groups' camps. So I think it's disturbing to see that many of these weapons have come from China and Russia, and a move in the UN Security Council to try to institute an arms embargo against Myanmar. But of course, China and Russia, being the largest providers of weapons to the military, have refused to do so.
I can't help but notice that the Russian Deputy Defense Minister was one of the special guests at the Armed Forces Day that was held by the junta. Brett, can I ask you, you started talking about the different tactics that the army used before. I mean, could we say that because they tried it on the Rohingya, they got away with it, so they are now trying the same thing on the urban population, or is it just the same old methods?
Well, I agree with everything that Christina said. I mean, it is about terror. I think that the limiting factor is with the Rohingya, they didn't really have to worry about public opinion. They had it on their side. And here they do have to be cautious. And as brutal as they are, I have no doubt that they're having discussions about how far is too far. And trying to calibrate what they're doing. So create as much terror as they can without losing, the broad mass of the population that would probably try to keep its head down in this situation and try to survive it, and not have them, join forces with Gen Z, if you want to call it, or the CDM more broadly. And they have both good cell structure to gain intelligence, and have shown that their intelligence is often very bad. They don't really know what's going on the ground, and they're out of touch often with what people are thinking. So I suspect that their efforts to try to calibrate will be, partially at least unsuccessful, and maybe largely unsuccessful. They may convince themselves, for instance, when things get quieter, that they've won, or that people are actually on their side. And one thing I've learned as an observer for all these years is that people will always stand up against the top Madal when they have a chance. When there's an opportunity, they are going to resist. That's very clear. And so, what they're having a problem with in considering their tactics is what their exit strategy is. How do they get back to a place where there's some semblance of stability? Because they've raised the ante so much. We haven't talked about the charges being filed against Aung San Suu Kyi, but I mean, that's another form of terror. They're trying to scare everybody. If they can do this to Suu Kyi now, which they didn't do in the past, they can do it to anybody. And I think that's their way. They're trying to basically cut off the head of what they think is the opposition. But I think, you made a good point earlier. This is a very diffuse movement, and it probably is to the advantage of protesters not to simply be led by one person or one small group of people. So I think they've boxed themselves in. They're going to have some tactical victories. They're going to feel like they have some short-term success, but they're going to have to manage their tactics, back to your question, very carefully, not to lose the broader public.
Let's talk about the last 10 years. It has not been perfect, but there was some sort of partial opening that allowed many of the private industries and the self-expressions and the press, for example, to blossom. So did the role of the civil society groups get stronger in the last 10 years? And do we see the effects of stronger civil society organizations in this current Burma Spring movement? How does it manifest? Maybe I'll start with Christina and then I'll ask for Ben to chime in.
Yes, absolutely. We have seen an explosion of civil society organizations in Myanmar over the past 10 years. Before that, under military rule, there were a number of civil society groups, but they were constrained in what they could do. They were mostly engaged in social welfare activities, education, religious activities. There were some underground groups who were trying to do political organizing or rights work, but they were very constrained. And in the 2010s, these groups were able to come out in the open. And as you said, also journalists were able to publish independently. Filmmakers, some of the films that are in this festival were made during the past 10 years that couldn't have happened earlier. So there's been a real kind of flowering or blossoming of civil society during the past 10 years, although there were still constraints on them, and people who criticized Min Aung Hlaing, the commander-in-chief, or Aung San Suu Kyi could end up in prison for that. I don't want to say that it was perfect, but I think one of the important things was that networks were formed between civil society organizations that worked in the heartland and the center of Myanmar, the Bama-dominated areas of Myanmar, and also in the ethnic areas. So if you think about education or land rights or natural resource management, health, et cetera, there were networks across different geographical areas, and that helped connect people who had not been connected before. And I think that is one thing we're seeing in the movement now post-coup, is that these networks are still there. And interestingly, there was a statement that was just released today where over 400 civil society groups signed a statement saying, we're very disappointed with how China has dealt with the coup and the support that they have given to the military government. They did not release the names of those organizations in order to protect them, but the fact that they could pull together after the coup a statement signed by 400 civil society groups, I think is extraordinary.
Ben, what do you think, the role of civil society organizations?
I can really only speak to this from my narrow set of experiences. But when I first arrived professionally, I was working in and about universities, and there was no chance that a civil society organization could have gone on campus and spoken or been invited to a classroom or anything of that sort. And as of the last time I was there in January 2020, I think that's right, I was having rectors and department heads asking me to bring in expertise to help inform faculty and students, even about contentious subjects like the ICC. We don't want the NLD's explanation of it. We want international expertise on what's happening. We had with co-writing assignments from faculty at law departments with CSOs on the plight of the Rohingya coming from within the country. That was incredibly different from when I got there. I'm not worried about civil society in Burma. They were strong in 2007. They're strong now. What bothers me and what scares me, and again, this is a narrow frame that I'm speaking about, is that when I got here, civil society was light years ahead of universities. And now we've had the opportunity to connect those, to make the networks that Christina was just talking about. And the civil societies will endure But what's happening with CDM and the replacement of teachers and the prohibition now of CSOs, whether they're dark or operating, they're not going to be on campus anymore. And the lost generations on the universities are going to lose all of that because they're the ones that were left behind. CSOs managed through connections in Bangkok, connections through the internet to thrive, whereas the university systems, which is where I work, have been completely left behind, and we're just now starting to catch up with civil society.
Let's talk about the digital nature of the revolution itself. On February 1st, 6:30 p.m. here in California, just when I was about to have dinner, I was turning on Facebook and I suddenly realized that I was watching live streams of a coup in progress because my friends were doing live streams of people who were being arrested and real-time updates, step by step, saying who is getting arrested when and now they are heading where. Utonia, how did you learn about the coup? And the fact that there are a lot of digital evidence that are available now about what the army has been doing. Do you think it will make it easier for us to hold the army accountable for it?
I learned from my brother who called me. Then I signed up for Facebook because I never had a social media present either on Twitter or Facebook. So I started both Twitter and Facebook right after the coup. So that's how I started. But so my brother would just calling me early morning. I answer, and so the coup was happening. So that's how I learned. But I think this question can be connected to the previous question about the realistic, whether it is realistic with the current movement, with the digital movement and digital democracy movement, I would call it, and this Gen Z and all the demands that are happening. And I think we also have to ask, and people have to ask the same question, is it realistic for the military to do what they are doing, as both Christina and Brad already alluded to such kind of question, which is, are they going to be successful by doing what they are doing, sniping, arresting, torturing, murdering, and imprisoning the whole country, right? And I think the answer is clearer for the democracy movement side. Their movement is far more realistic than the military's oppression and the practice of the movement, right? And so the digital democracy movement play a critical role. But before I go there, I want to pinpoint the answer for the military side based on the Chinese connection. China saw military weapon from 2008 and 2018, 10 years framework, 1.3 billion worth of US dollar worth of weapon to Myanmar. And that exclude China selling to UWSA, WA, and other ethnic minority like AA and KIA and so on. So China has been a primary beneficiary of the military government's presence since Kenyan era, and Niwen era, you can name it, way back all the way to so I think they are banking on both Russia and China's support behind them with this all-out violence that they're going after. Now ASEAN is sort of with that side. So with the digital democracy movement, we are now unfolding all of that. IFA, VOA, and BBC, as soon as the movement came up, and as soon as the Facebook live feed came out of Myanmar, beginning with the drumming of these pots and pans to the street protests, with 1988 music being reenacted to the street protests and things like that. And so what we're seeing is a very dynamic democracy movement. This is probably the largest and the most dynamic democracy movement that the world had ever seen since maybe civil rights movement in the United States in the domestic sense of movement, right? And so I think the power of this digital democracy movement cannot be underestimated. I mean, as I am reading here posts of my colleagues and friends in Myanmar about their posts, and that while they're sleeping, their voices are being heard by people like us here, right? And that is really, really important for this democracy movement. So with that, I think the people of all sorts in Myanmar, including in addition to civil society groups, Myanmar has a significant, in fact, about over 60% of youth left for South Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia for migrant working. And with that experience, they had connected back to their home with information about dishes they eat, in Malaysia, Singapore, movie they like, in YouTube they watch, and all of that, right? So that digital world had transformed not only sort of the presence of civil society, but also the rural population. Right now, we're seeing in all corner of Myanmar, small villages are organizing their, videotaping their movement and posting in the Facebooks, and you can see it in a small village in Sagaing, at the corner of where the Second World War happened. Anyway, so I think this connection cannot be underestimated, and I hope the world citizen, digital citizen like us, now I'm becoming fully digital citizen with my Facebook and my Twitter, and we should be using this power that we have by sharing, clicking, and just doing what the Gen Z is capable of doing. So I think the military will have a hard time controlling it, even though they may be gaining some information, access to these individuals and so on. So I'm quite hopeful, connecting with the previous question and connecting to this current question that you are asking. So.
Brad, what do you think? The fact that we now have lots and lots of digital footage of human rights violation, does it make your job easier, for example? On mute.
Sorry, Kenneth, I want to compliment you on inviting 4 of us who have never been on Facebook before. I also was not on Facebook before.
That's a great success for me then.
I don't know how you could find 4 people who weren't on Facebook before, but you did it. Congratulations.
I found them. I found you all on Facebook, by the way.
I mean, I spend a fair bit of my time, just to let you know, fighting with Facebook. Fighting with Facebook on hate speech in Burma for years. Fighting with Facebook on conniving with the Vietnamese government, for example, to go after bloggers. We'll have to watch that space and make sure that they don't decide someday to start going after some of the protesters. I don't think there's any likelihood of that in the short term. Yes, to answer your question, this is a big difference now. We are, and many organizations are creating digital archives of things that we are coming across. There's universities like Berkeley have excellent digital labs that are scraping material, that they're archiving that material. It's going to take a long time to sift through it. The real question will be not in the end whether we have enough digital data to support prosecutions. It will be, what will be the venue? How will we get to the point where there will be prosecutions, where we either get the ICC or an ad hoc tribunal set up to deal with this? I also think this stuff will feed into the mindset of the judges at the International Court of Justice, who don't have jurisdiction over any of this, but they'll read the newspapers and they'll see some of the things that are produced by human rights organizations like ours or the UN or others that end up in the media. And they'll understand the brutality of the Tatmadaw even more. So yeah, I think this will be a very powerful tool, and despite their best efforts, they're not going to be able to stop smoking gun evidence from being made available of a lot of crimes. And then it's going to be our job to explain, for instance, the chain of command, to make sure that we understand that the person who fired the sniper shot at the child is part of a chain of command that goes up to Min Aung Hlaing. I don't think that's very hard, but that's something that we're going to have to do.
Let's talk about the international response. In a way, one of the audience members have actually posed that question as well. And I also want to ask the audience members, if you're listening to us and if you have specific questions for any one of the panelists or the panel in general, please send your questions in and we'll try to address as many of them as possible. The question is, how should, I'm paraphrasing here, how should US be responding to countries that contribute or support governments or juntas that commit these atrocities, like the ones that we're looking at in Myanmar? And I'm sure you have also seen, when you look at protest footage, Myanmar protesters carrying signs that says, "We want R2P, responsibility to protect," or "Please recognize National Unity Government, NUG." What can we expect the international community to do? What can we ask our own governments to do? And is something like R2P a realistic thing for us to go and knock on our senator's door and says, please give them R2P? Is that realistic? I'm going to start with you, Gotomye. What are your thoughts on that?
The definition of R2P is the responsibility of a sovereign state. A sovereign state, I want to clarify that, to protect its own citizen. That's R2P. definition. Now in Myanmar, what is happening is the sovereign state itself is killing people. Sovereign state itself is committing these atrocities, right? And sovereign state itself committed Rohingya genocide, right? And so that state should have been kicked out of the United Nations. That state, that Myanmar state, that which means the military leaders and military state would have been. So this is how Myanmar people, public, children, teenagers, high school students understand R2P. And they are implementing their own made in Myanmar R2P, which is what you are seeing in response to the military's atrocities, right? And so that is one part. The legal route, if you were to go, so R2P is not international law yet. I think I could be corrected by two other panelists here who have been working on that, and that Brad and Ben especially. It's a doctrine. It's a doctrine just basically to make sure that United Nations Charter, Article Chapter 1, Article 2, Clause 7 is maintained. Its integrity is maintained. And so to do so, you have Chapter 6 and 7 to enact, depending on the severity of the conflict. Myanmar deserves beyond Chapter 7 now, in terms of that state that I described. The state itself is killing. The state itself is making the whole country like a prison, okay? It is, I mean, you can now daily talk to Myanmar citizens, those who do not have Facebook as well, and those who, which I do often, calling them, and they feel no safe at all. They don't feel like safe at all to walk on the street. The bullet could have come from, the soldier could have arrested and pressed for money, ransom. So that is the state that China is calling the state of Myanmar. ASEAN is calling the state of Myanmar, state. I mean, this is not a state. This is basically the largest terrorist organization in the world that we are seeing. So I think people need to be realistic and practical and factual and thinking about it in terms of implementing that responsibility to state, responsibility to protect through the UN China. It is quite impossible. And we cannot expect international community will come and do for Myanmar to implement R2P. We can't expect something like what Brett was talking about after the fact, after the evidence are laid out and kept and recorded and documented. We can see that kind of trials coming like a Dutch trial for Cambodian military leaders and things like that. So I would like to say R2P in terms of international version that we are expecting basically is not realistic at all.
Christina, what do you think? What are the things that we can expect the international power brokers and international organizations to do to bring about a peaceful resolution, even if R2P is not on the table?
Well, not recognizing the military regime as the legitimate government of the country is probably the most important thing. And I would say that it's very positive that even some countries in ASEAN have still not recognized the military regime as legitimate. For instance, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia have not recognized the regime as the legitimate government. The National Unity Government, which is the parallel government set up by people who were part of the elected government and ethnic representatives, have called on the international community to recognize them as the legitimate government. And it looks like some countries perhaps in Europe, will recognize them as the legitimate government in Myanmar. Other countries may not, for various reasons, take that step, but as long as they're working with the National Unity Government as the de facto legitimate government, I think that that's still valuable. The other point that I'd like to make is that it's important for the international community to work together on this. And there are a number of actors. Both the US and China have said, ASEAN, we're going to let you take care of this. For those who don't know ASEAN, that means the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. But really, ASEAN cannot do this alone. It's very important for countries like Japan and South Korea, potentially India, to be brought into a coalition of countries who are working together to restore, even if they don't believe in democracy, restore stability in Myanmar. Because as long as this regime is in power, there will not be stability. There will not be opportunities for all of these countries to engage in business in Myanmar. You know, in the 2010s, Myanmar was this exciting emerging market. And there are a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that invested in Myanmar. where are those investments going today? Nowhere. So even if you only care about business, it's important to see this military regime removed from power and a legitimate government back in power.
Ben, what do you think? R2P is just a doctrine, but is it something that the Burmese protesters can rely on to get the help that they need, or are there something else that they should be asking for?
I fully agree with Christina, and I think the international approach should be about recognition. R2P, and I think I wrote it in the chat, the ubiquitous response that you see online all the time is the people want R2P, but what they get is RIP. And I'm afraid that's the truth. One of the underlying precepts of R2P and intervention at all is that it has a reasonable chance of success. And unfortunately for Burma, they're sandwiched between the two biggest, most populous countries in the world. They have over 1 million man standing army. There's no chance of reasonable success of military intervention without making things much worse. Where could you do a no-fly zone? Where could you do any of those things? An arms embargo could be useful, but the inequality of arms between these two, between the Tatmadaw and even all of the EAOs combined, is so great that I don't think it's reasonable. So, I mean, I'm so impressed by the Burmese in general. I mean, you ask the common an American or any Westerner what R2P is, and they wouldn't know. But every single person in Burma can tell you. But unfortunately, it's not set up to handle this sort of situation. So I don't think that's the right approach. I don't even theoretically if it's even right from that standpoint. I mean, it's more self-defense, right? I think self-defense is easier to stand by, but there's lots of people talking about this who are smarter than I am. I know on Aid Exchange, they did a huge discussion with many people talking about R2P. So I don't want to go any further with that, but I agree with Christina. It's about recognition. And if you can't go full recognition, at least work with them prior to that.
So Brad, what about you? What do you think? ASEAN, EU, UN, what are they doing right? What are they not doing enough?
They're not doing almost anything right or enough. I mean, the idea that ASEAN, which was formed as a club of dictators and still is largely a club of dictators, would ever take the leading role in trying to reverse a coup is just laughable. I mean, next door, General Prayut came to power through a coup. Hun Sen came to power, held on to power through a coup 25 years ago. The Kingdom of Brunei, they're going to lead on democracy. Indonesia, Malaysia, if they were going to be really serious and do something dramatic, they would have done it over the Rohingya crisis, because that galvanized public opinion in their countries. So I think the idea that the United States, the EU, and Japan would hide behind behind ASEAN is just a massive act of political cowardice. And we warned them about that before Wendy Sherman went out there, before the ASEAN summit. We've talked to everybody and said, do not let ASEAN take the lead. Do not play that game. We've seen that movie before. It's happened with every crisis, whether it was with Burma or Cambodia or other crises within ASEAN. The idea that ASEAN will stand up for democracy is absurd. So what should be done? I mean, I think recognition is important. It's not something Human Rights Watch takes a position on, I should say. But politically, I can see that being important, but only if it leads somewhere. Where should it lead? If you recognize the NUG and you don't recognize the Tatmadaw, some things should follow. The most obvious thing, and I think the most important thing, is an absolute squeeze on money into the country and into the hands of military leadership, their personal bank accounts, their corporate bank accounts, the military-owned and controlled businesses, the businesses of cronies. Really, the only way that I can see changing the dynamic from the outside is by making it clear to the leadership and the people who depend on leadership for their wealth that they will lose that wealth. They will not have access to the money that sits outside the country. Can this be done? Yes. In fact, if the US Treasury basically made it illegal for banks to do dollar-denominated transactions, if the European Central Bank did the same, if the Japanese Central Bank did the same, the country would be, the people who have stashed their gazillions outside the country would be in serious jeopardy. And look, I think if we see a hopeful scenario, it's not that outside armies are going to come in and bomb the country and take over and herald in some new era of democracy, that would just be a bloodbath. And all US-led military interventions have ended badly. It's going to be that they're going to cause a fracture inside the military. This has to happen. For there to be change in the short term, there have to be people inside the military leadership and their extended family, in other words, businesses, that do not think that this is the way forward. This is a big step backwards. And I think there's reason to be hopeful, because as many people in this conversation have said, things have changed so much in the last 10 years. People do not want to go backwards. They don't want to be isolated. They don't want the country to be living hand to mouth. They don't want people to be hungry in the countryside. They don't want to be cut off from the rest of the world. And the only way I can see in the short and medium term of accomplishing that objective is to go after the money. The money is the key thing. And so far we've seen some nice announcements. We've seen some intentions stated by different governments, but we haven't seen the kind of action that we would expect if they thought this was, for example, a central strategic interest globally. And that's our job. That's our challenge, is to convince them that this is a strategic, important interest for them.
All right. Before I wrap up, because the hour is up, but before I wrap up and thank the audience and bring this to a formal conclusion, I thought I'll give Sia Utonia the last word. Sia Utonia, do you have any message for your brothers and sisters back home protesting, or do you have a message for ASEAN, UN to say, do this right now, you're not doing this and you should be doing it, whatever that might be? Your last word.
Thank you very much. That's quite an honor in front of these people who have been doing a lot of great things in the world for human rights and democracy. So I would start with the following up to Christina and Brad's comment about, if the recognition is made, there should be some sort of consequential action follow. Following the money and following the draining the military's capability is important, or basically not funding the military's action. So if you follow that thread, Singapore is the largest foreign investor in Myanmar, and followed by China and Hong Kong. And so basically all Chinese sort of civilization sense of it, investing in Myanmar. And Singapore invests in Myanmar for land related investment, also the banking. China, obviously, gas pipeline and so on. All of these could be put into the equation of the governments or state that are in supportive of NUG and in supportive, very sympathetic with the Myanmar public, and they should be working, and they can do so. And we are seeing that President Biden, since February 11, with his executive order, have started this all kinds of targeted sanction. UK, European Unions, and Canadians and New Zealand governments are doing it. And I think coordinated effort is needed to really stop the money flowing into military, Myanmar military, families, and also the institution I'm talking about. And it's critical, and that has to be done. That is more critical than actually the imposing global arms embargo, which Ben was alluded to, which is important, but in the sense that it would be the balance of power within Myanmar between PDF and the army is quite different. So thinking as such is a really creative thinking. The other is we're dealing with, when we talk about international issue, we're dealing with the state-centric politics that is quite outdated. State-centric politics was powerful and necessary after the Second World War to prevent war among states. And we have graduated, the world has graduated to a level where all of us individuals, as you are looking at this computer screen or phone screen that you're looking at, we are connected. Your phone is made by thousands and thousands and thousands of people all across the planet, including miners of these material to the softwares and the network and so on. So what I'm trying to get is the global state-centric politics is quite outdated, and leaders who are sympathetic to democracy, human rights, and openness or anti-Chinese and anti-Russian model have to think creatively about the world politics that they are exercising through diplomatic channels and their power. So I think if you do that, I think the Biden administration and others who are sympathetic to the Myanmar movement will find creative ways to implement what Brad was talking about, okay? That's, I would like to tell the international leader, be smart, be creative, follow the Gen Z of the world, not just Myanmar. To my brothers and sisters and the citizens of Myanmar, it is impressive what you have done since February 1st, that you have denied the military, which is the most powerful military in Southeast Asia, to finish their coup. And not only that, you have denied the power to function as a military government. And so your power and your integrity and the hill you are sitting, moral high ground that you are sitting with this CDM movement, peaceful protest, and poets who are reading poems, and musicians who are playing music, and the artists who are doing artistic sort of participation in this movement. It's such an impressive movement. The world is noticing and the world is recognizing. With that, you are not alone. And my brothers are not alone. My family is not alone in Myanmar. All of my 5 brothers who live now in Myanmar with my 17 nieces and nephews, they are not alone, but they are active. And so the thing that they need to think is that moral high ground and the moral ethical movement that you have built is pretty important for not just for Myanmar's future, but for the future of democracy in the world. And so equally, global citizens should be paying attention, and United States citizens should be paying attention. 232 years of democracy that you have lived on the planet as the longest democracy in the United States. You face January 6th, a nearly military coup situation in Myanmar. If the institutional and historical backgrounds are like Myanmar, if you have Myanmar military leaders in United States, on the other hand, you could have been protesting on the street like Myanmar people are. You could have been participating like a CDM participant in Myanmar people are. So with that, I want to sort of issue the intricacies and importance of the sustaining rule-based order through the democracy, the best system we can organize for a community, a group of people in the world. So I think it is really critical that the Myanmar citizens and global citizens all together across the world, working together, and it's a critical. And I said this with the experience of Mutual Aid Myanmar. We have now 59 countries, citizens from 59 countries contributed from $1 to 10,000 US dollar, individuals and companies and organizations. And they have made a huge difference to these 6,000 CDM participants in Myanmar. And that connection and that force need to be nurtured. So with that, I will conclude with that. Thank you so much for giving me time. I'm sorry if I talk too much in that.
Not at all, not at all. I still wanted to ask you one final question. You are writing a book. Is that something that you can name? And for example, is there a title? And can we expect to be able to read it at some point?
The working title I have is The Art of Resilience. It's a short title, maybe secondary title, but the resilience of the polycentric nature of Myanmar people. I'm now not just talking about Burman culture and Burman religion and Burman culture. I'm talking about all works of like minorities and different ethnic groups. How the Myanmar kingdoms, since began, trying to organize this unifying state, has failed one king after another, and it has failed one government after another since the independence. The reason that I'm trying in this book, I'm trying to lay out why that is happening and what are the possible future for Myanmar, which will be different from sort of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan-centric state, Eurocentric state, and that is outdated for the world, as I said, and what kind of new state that Myanmar can craft, and maybe the new type of state need to be considered, not just through this theory of Leviathan and so on. So that's what I'm trying to academically bring a theory of state from Myanmar experience and how it is challenging to build a state in Myanmar and why, and what can we learn positively to redefine the state in the world, not just for Myanmar and not just for Southeast Asia. So that is sort of a very broad description of the theoretical orientation of the book that I'm writing.
We look forward to that. Christina, is your book at a stage where you can announce the title and the theme at the very least to us?
It's the working title is Developing Myanmar. And as I said, it's about the 2010s and looking at both the positive things that came out of that period, but also what were the barriers to change and what were the disappointments during that period. So what are the lessons learned for the next time we get back to a more open, inclusive environment in Myanmar?
Very good. We are 10 minutes over the hour, but I would say that that 10 minutes been well spent. So tomorrow, June 11th, that's California time, tomorrow, June 11th at 6 p.m., I will be speaking to 2 union ministers from the National Unity Government, and I will perhaps raise some of the questions that were left and answered by this panel. This is also part of the Speakers Forum series, so I hope you can join us. Until next time, until next forum, and I'll see you again. I'm Kenneth Wong. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Max and Greg, 2 tech specialists who made us all look good and sound good throughout this forum. So that's all for today. We are out.